My son gripped my wrist so hard it hurt. I looked down at his tiny shaking hand, his fingers digging deep into my skin as if he were trying to anchor himself to a world that was about to fall apart. For a second I thought he was going to cry, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in and spoke in a whisper so quiet it felt dangerous. "Mom, can we please not go home tonight? Just for tonight. I heard Dad planning to do something terrible to us." I stared at him, my mind completely blank. I didn't get it. Not yet. But that was the exact moment I should have listened. "My name is Ava Latimer. I want to tell you about the morning I almost lost everything, including my life, without even knowing it. At 5:47 a.m., according to the digital clock on the microwave, I started packing his backpack. Not because Wyatt asked me to, he never did. Over our 8 years of marriage, I had simply learned that doing things myself was always faster than relying on a man who lived in our house like a hotel guest who never fully unpacked. The only light in the kitchen came from the stove hood. The coffee maker was already dripping, black, 2 sugars, no milk, just the way he liked it. I could make it with my eyes closed. It was a routine so deeply ingrained that my hands just did it on autopilot. I had been married to Wyatt Pickens for 8 years. We had a 10-year-old adopted son named Cash, who was the absolute best thing that ever happened to me. To the outside world, our family and our lives were exactly what Wyatt needed them to see: stable, loyal, and perfect. In our wealthy southern suburb, we were the model family at church and in the neighborhood. On that Tuesday morning, everything still looked perfect on the surface. Around 5:45, Cash came downstairs. I heard his footsteps first, soft, hesitant, the sound of a kid who was awake but not ready to face the day. He sat at the kitchen table holding his orange juice with both hands, totally silent. I noticed, but I just chalked it up to him being tired and didn't push. Wyatt came down at 6:30 a.m., fully dressed in a sharp suit, completely in work mode. He kissed my forehead, smelling of the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. He asked Cash a quick question about his school science project, but his voice sounded like an actor forcing his way through lines he hadn't fully memorized. Cash gave a one-word answer. Wyatt either didn't notice or just didn't care. Even after 8 years, I still couldn't tell the difference. If you're watching this and you know exactly what I mean, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know who else relates to this. At 6:50, we loaded the SUV. On the way to the Atlanta airport, Wyatt kept the mood light. He talked about some work story I barely registered, mentioned the upcoming thunderstorms, and brought up next month's church fundraiser. I just nodded along, my mind on the dry cleaning. At the departures terminal, he checked his bags and turned to hug me. The hug lasted the exact same amount of time it always did, never a second longer. I watched him walk through the automatic glass doors and disappear. I felt absolutely nothing. Driving back, I passed the CVS where I pick up my prescriptions every 3rd Thursday. Seeing that red sign triggered a memory I had buried long ago. A dinner table, 8 years back. I had just told Wyatt I could never get pregnant. I remembered his face. There was a fraction of a second, just a brief moment, before his mask of sincere sympathy slipped back on. I had noticed it back then, filed it away, and never opened it again. I kept it closed and kept driving. About 12 minutes from the airport, Cash called my name very quietly. He was staring straight ahead, his voice filled with caution. It was the tone of a kid who had practiced what he wanted to say for a very long time. "Mom, can we please not go home tonight? Just for tonight. I heard Dad planning to do something terrible to us." I almost laughed. I figured his anxiety was just acting up. I thought the quiet tension in our house had finally built up in his little mind into something he couldn't carry alone. I asked him what he meant. He gave me broken pieces of a conversation. "Tomorrow night, make sure they're inside." He also heard his own name, mentioned in a way he couldn't fully explain. Something shifted in my chest, a feeling I couldn't quite name. I told him we would go stay at my mom's house, keeping my voice light and cheerful, like it was a fun little trip. He turned to look out the window, his hands tightly clasped in his lap. I turned up the radio. I told myself he was only 10. I almost convinced myself that I would just talk to him about it the next day. The next day? At 8:13 p.m., Cash fell asleep on my mother's couch. I knew the exact time because I had been watching him. I watched his breathing slow down and his fingers loosen their grip on the throw pillow. I remember thinking that when a child falls asleep that quickly in an unfamiliar place, they are either completely safe or completely exhausted. For Cash, it was always both. Sitting on the other side of the living room, my mind drifted back to a place I hadn't gone in a very long time. The first time I really saw Wyatt Pickens was 7 years ago at a statewide church networking seminar. He was sitting on a panel and asked a sharp, incredibly precise question that made the whole room turn to look at him. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He was just so precise that people instinctively leaned in to listen. I remember watching him from the second row, thinking how calm and composed he was. I thought, this man sees everything. I was only half right. Wyatt saw everything that was useful to him. Everything else he ignored. He pursued me in a way that felt deeply spiritual at the time. Looking back, I realize it was pure strategy, patient, calculated, and steady. His courtship had a rhythm. He called at the perfect times, never overstayed his visits, and remembered the tiny details you mentioned just to bring them up later, making you feel completely seen. He won over my mother, Olivia, in a way that makes me cringe to think about now. He memorized her birthday, brought the perfect gifts, and asked about her health in a tone that made her feel incredibly special. She once told me, "That man knows how to present himself." She meant it as a compliment. She was right about the presentation, but she was entirely wrong about the motive. Before we got married, I sat across from him at dinner and told him the truth. I couldn't have children. I had found out when I was 23, premature ovarian failure. The doctor had been kind but direct, and I had learned to treat life the same way. I told Wyatt because he had a right to know before we made any permanent commitments. He didn't answer right away. He picked up his wine glass, set it down, and looked at me for a long time. Then he said it didn't matter. His eyes were steady and warm. I had spent my whole life learning to read people, but I completely misread him. What I missed, what I had caught for only a split second and then dismissed, wasn't sadness or acceptance. It was calculation. A quiet, unhurried calculation. He had just received a piece of information, and he was already figuring out how to use it. He spent the next several years planning. The first year of marriage felt like a partnership. The second felt like management. By the third, I had developed a coping mechanism I never even named. I avoided certain topics, walked on eggshells around his moods, and filled the silence before it could turn into something worse. Around our second anniversary, I asked him directly if something was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," he said with a smile. "You're overthinking." I apologized. That's how those moments always ended. I told myself all marriages take work. I was right about that, but I had no idea what kind of danger I was navigating. Wyatt grew up in a family that valued reputation far more than any scripture. His father was a church deacon, and his mother ran the women's ministry for 14 years. He learned early on that as long as you keep up appearances, nobody looks too closely at what's happening behind closed doors. He didn't practice kindness. He performed it. And that gap was wide enough to hide a lifetime of dark secrets. When I insisted on adoption, he agreed because refusing would have forced him to reveal his true colors. A man who wouldn't adopt a child in need when his wife couldn't conceive would be judged harshly in our conservative community. Wyatt couldn't afford that hit to his reputation, so he signed the papers, shook hands with the social workers, and played the role of a loving father just well enough to get by, but without a single shred of real warmth. 14 months before the fire, he quietly took out a life insurance policy on me through an agent outside our usual circle. He kept the premium small enough to blend into our monthly credit card statements. Around the same time, he started seeing a woman who lived 3 hours away. He told her our marriage was over and that I never wanted children. While he was telling her those lies, I was sitting at our table, filling out the mountains of paperwork to adopt Cash. Sitting in that room watching my son sleep, I had absolutely no idea. My phone buzzed on the cushion next to me. It was a text from Wyatt. "Landed safely. Miss you already." I stared at the screen a second too long. Then I smiled, flipped the phone face down and closed my eyes. The next morning, before I could even fully wake up, I saw him at the kitchen table. Cash was already sitting there when I came downstairs, his notebook open, his pencil moving, completely lost in his drawings. He hadn't heard me come down. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before making a sound. That was always when I saw him most clearly, in those quiet, unguarded seconds before he knew anyone was there. His biological mother had passed away when he was 4 in a Tuesday car crash. Just a normal day, the wrong intersection, the wrong second. The great aunt who took him in tried her best for 2 years until her health and tiny income couldn't handle it anymore. It wasn't abandonment. It was just a sad reality. But a 6-year-old doesn't have the words to understand that. Instead, Cash learned to make himself small, never ask for anything, and always read the room before stepping inside. The first time the social worker brought him to our house, he stood at the entrance of the living room for a full minute, just observing. Only after he had mapped out everything, the furniture, the light, the space, did he take a step. I saw so much of myself in that moment that I had to look away. I sat on the couch and let him take his time. I didn't rush him or force a fake, overwhelming welcome, and I think that's what finally made him feel safe enough to walk in. Our bond wasn't built overnight. It was made of tiny moments. The morning he had a nightmare and I sat on his bedroom floor. Not on the bed, not hovering over him, just sitting on the floor, until his breathing calmed down. The afternoon he waited 2 days to show me a bad grade because he thought he'd be punished, and instead I took him out for ice cream and told him we'd figure it out together. The first time he called me Mom, his voice was so quiet I barely heard it. I pretended I didn't, just to take the pressure off him. I walked into the kitchen and stood at the sink with my eyes closed for a long time. Wyatt never raised his voice at him, not once. What he did was quieter, and in some ways, much worse. He treated Cash like a piece of furniture, present, occasionally in the way, but never spoken to unless absolutely necessary. He only asked superficial questions about school when I insisted, looking like a reserved, quiet father from a distance. But Cash was never fooled. He cataloged every single slight, keeping track of things he didn't even have names for yet, carefully, thoroughly, and always silently. The day before we went to the airport, Cash forgot his tablet at home. I sent him back inside to grab it while I ran a quick errand nearby. He walked through the house silently, the way he always did, not trying to sneak around, just moving with the natural quietness of a kid who had learned not to take up too much space. He heard voices coming from Wyatt's study. The door wasn't fully closed. It wasn't Wyatt's usual business voice. It was lower, more deliberate. Cash didn't stop immediately, he just slowed his pace. Then he heard his name. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't a full sentence, but it was enough to make him freeze. His body reacted before his brain did. He stepped back, waited, and listened. The words were disjointed and broken. Tomorrow night. Make sure they're inside. A pause, and then his name again. It wasn't connected to a sentence he could fully comprehend, but it was connected to something incredibly wrong. Cash didn't try to make sense of it all. Kids like him don't need full sentences. They listen to tone, to danger, to the things left unsaid. Before the meaning could even form in his mind, his stomach tightened. He moved on instinct, pulling the hallway closet door nearly shut and slipping inside, hiding just out of sight. He stayed there, listening. For a split second he heard footsteps near the door, a chair scraping, a sound that made him hold his breath. Then, the footsteps faded away. He didn't come out right away. He started counting, not numbers, but time. The way kids count when they're scared, waiting much longer than they think they need to. When he finally stepped out, the house felt exactly the same. Quiet, normal. But it wasn't. He didn't grab his tablet. He walked outside, sat on the front steps, and remained completely still with his hands tucked between his knees, processing the only way he knew how. He wasn't thinking about what the words meant. He was feeling the weight of impending disaster. He sat there for a long time, until that feeling settled into something he could carry. He decided to wait until Wyatt left to say anything. A deep instinct, the same one that made him stand at the doorway and observe before entering a room, told him that speaking up too early in that house could be incredibly dangerous. I finished my coffee and told him it was time to go home. He looked up from his notebook, his face showing a mix of fear and relief. He carefully closed it and stood up without a word. I found myself instinctively reaching for my car keys. That morning looked like any other day when nothing bad is supposed to happen. The sky was blue, and suburban Atlanta traffic was surprisingly light. Cash had his window cracked open, and I could hear the wind whistling through the gap. I was thinking about dinner. I wondered if we had enough food in the fridge, or if I needed to stop by the store. They were the most mundane thoughts, the kind that fill your head when you believe you're returning to your normal life. Out of habit, I turned onto our street, but I never made it down the block. The first thing I saw was a roadblock. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a police cruiser parked diagonally across the entrance, its lights still spinning slowly, even though whatever emergency had called them there was long over. Behind the police car, further down the street, I could see the red and white tops of emergency vehicles cutting through the quiet Tuesday morning. Neighbors stood on the sidewalks in small groups, just watching. I instinctively slowed down, my hands gripping the steering wheel. From where I sat, I couldn't see our house directly. I could only see the street, the vehicles, and the heavy silence that settles over a place after a disaster. Cash leaned forward in his seat. "Mom." He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't answer. I let the car coast forward very slowly, just enough to get a clearer view past the police car. I didn't get too close or draw attention to us. I just wanted to confirm what my body already knew before my brain could process it. Further down the block, there were heavy black smoke stains, dark, warped, and permanent. I stopped breathing for a second. Something primal inside me tightened and froze. "Don't go any closer." It wasn't fear or panic, it was a pure survival instinct. I reached for my phone, my finger hovering over the screen. 911. It should have been the most natural thing to do. I pressed call, but after one ring I hung up immediately. It wasn't because I didn't need help. It was because a sudden chilling clarity washed over me. Whatever had happened on that street was done under the assumption that we were inside that house. If I rushed onto that scene without knowing who knew what, I would be walking straight into a trap that wasn't finished yet. I slowly lowered my phone and took my foot off the brake. The car rolled backward quietly and smoothly. Then I turned the wheel and drove away. No hesitation, no looking back. In the rearview mirror, the flashing emergency lights grew smaller and smaller, like a disaster belonging to someone else's world. Cash started to turn around to look. I reached over and gently pressed his arm. "Don't look." He immediately turned back and stared straight ahead. We drove in silence for 2 blocks, then 3. I took a turn I didn't need to take, and then another. I kept driving until the flashing lights were completely gone, and the streets looked like any other neighborhood in the city. Only then did I pull over. The engine was still running. I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I didn't cry. My mind was racing, but it was controlled and deliberate. Important documents, clothes, his school bag, my work laptop, the photos on the mantle, and then the list stopped. None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that we were supposed to be in that house last night. I was supposed to be in that house. Cash was supposed to be in that house. I closed my eyes for just a second. They think we were inside. I opened my eyes. Cash hadn't moved. His hands were still tightly clasped in his lap, just like the day before when he told me what he'd heard. For the first time since we left our street, I turned to look at him. "You told me the truth," I said softly, "and I didn't listen. I'm sorry." He nodded once. No hesitation, no explanation needed. I turned off the radio. The silence in the car felt cleaner now, a space where we could actually think. I hadn't called the police back, not because I didn't plan to, but because I needed a completely safe, controlled environment before saying anything I couldn't take back. So I drove straight to my mother's house. When I pulled into the driveway, my brother Sam was already outside talking on his phone. He took one look at my face and hung up immediately. "A neighbor called," he said. "They said there's a fire on your street." I nodded. He instinctively lowered his voice and stepped closer to the window. "It's already on the local news. They're saying the fire is suspicious. The fire marshals are already on it." I let that word sink in. Suspicious. It meant someone had already seen what I didn't even need to get close to know. It meant this wasn't an accident. It was intentional. I turned off the engine and we sat in silence for a moment. Then I opened the door and we walked inside. My mother, Olivia, took one look at me and cleared the kitchen. There were no explanations or demands for answers. She just gave me that look only a mother can give. The look of someone who already knows something terrible has happened and has just been waiting for the confirmation. She turned to the rest of the house and said, "Give us the room." It was just the 2 of us at the kitchen table. She poured a cup of tea that neither of us touched. I told her everything, step by step. Cash's warning in the car, our decision to stay the night, the drive back this morning, turning onto our street, the police block, the emergency vehicles in the distance, and the neighbors gathered around the aftermath. I told her I didn't get close because I didn't need to. My body had realized before my brain did that someone had targeted that house. Sam's news about the fire being deemed suspicious filled in the remaining blanks. My mother was never one to interrupt, but she was also not a woman who sat quietly in the face of trouble. She had strong opinions, spoke her mind, and had never played the victim a day in her life. Seeing her sit there in complete silence made me realize she understood the full weight of what we were dealing with. As the rest of the family started coming into the room, the reactions came in waves. Sam immediately reached for his phone. "We need to go to the police right now and lay everything out." My mother didn't look at him. "Let her finish speaking first," she said calmly. He stopped. My sister Laura paced back and forth before turning to us. "We should go confront him. If he did this—" "We are not doing anything rash," my mother said, her quiet voice carrying an absolute authority that settled the room. My uncle became incredibly quiet. That kind of silence is far more intense than any shouting, because it means someone has moved past anger and into a completely different state of focus. Then my cousin said what someone always says in these moments. "Are we sure? Maybe it was just faulty wiring. These things happen." The atmosphere shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was clear that not everyone was on the same page. My mother ignored the comment and kept her eyes locked on me. "Do you have your ID?" she asked. "Do you have access to your bank accounts?" It wasn't, "Are you okay?" or "I can't believe this." It was pure, practical survival. It was the question of a woman who had spent her life quietly preparing for the worst. I nodded. "Yes." Sam walked out of the room, already dialing. He wasn't calling 911. I could hear the shift in his voice. Controlled, professional. He was calling a lawyer who knew how to handle something of this scale. Then Laura spoke up. "I never trusted him. I only kept my mouth shut because you loved him, and I didn't want to cause trouble." I had made it through the drive. I had walked away from the scene without breaking down. But that sentence broke me. I didn't sob or scream. I just sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by my family, crying completely silently. Nobody tried to rush me. Cash was in the next room, and everyone knew he could hear us. My uncle stood up without a word, walked in, and sat down next to him, turning the TV to whatever channel Cash wanted. He didn't ask questions or try to explain anything. He just sat with him. It was the most important thing anyone did that afternoon. When Sam walked back in, his voice was steady. "I talked to the lawyer. We aren't making any statements yet. Not until we know exactly what the police are putting out." That was how it started. The lawyer called back within an hour, completely direct and businesslike. The fire had been officially logged as suspected arson. A missing persons report was being drafted, and if my name wasn't in the national database yet, it would be within hours. "I only need to know one thing," the lawyer said. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes." "Good. Stay exactly where you are and do not contact law enforcement directly. I will handle all communications." There was a brief pause on the line. "Now, if your husband believes you were in that house, let's not correct that assumption just yet. We need to let the investigation play out without interference." I understood immediately. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about building a case. That night, the lawyer contacted the lead arson investigator through official channels. He didn't offer theories or speculation. He simply confirmed that I was alive, legally represented, and would cooperate at the appropriate time. That one call did two things. It protected my family from any potential legal trouble, and it kept Wyatt completely in the dark. My phone had been turned off and left at my mother's house since the morning of the airport run. Sam got me a burner phone. By that evening, my name was already on the local news. I sat at the dining room table watching it happen in real time. Residential fire under investigation. One occupant unaccounted for, followed by my name, age, and address. I read the word unaccounted without any emotion. Missing, not confirmed dead, not yet. I noted the distinction and kept reading. 4 days later, the doorbell rang. Sam opened it. Wyatt was standing on the porch in a perfectly pressed suit, his eyes showing the slight redness of a man who had practiced being grief-stricken long enough to almost believe his own act. He had already spoken to the police once. I could tell by the way he answered Sam's first question, carefully choosing every word, saying absolutely nothing beyond what the authorities had already made public. Sam let him inside. It was a deliberate choice, not a passive one. Every word Wyatt spoke in that living room was potential evidence. He sat down and accepted a glass of water from my mother, completely missing the coldness in her gesture. He talked about what a wonderful woman I was, using the past tense. My mother noticed instantly. He stayed for 20 minutes, hugged her at the door, and told Sam to call if they needed anything at all. I was in the back bedroom the entire time, listening to his voice through the wall. I couldn't make out the exact words, just the tone, that carefully constructed performance of grief. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the man who had tried to erase me from the earth, comforting my family just 12 feet away. Cash and my uncle were in the furthest room with the TV turned up loud. Cash never came out, and Wyatt had no idea he was even there. After the front door closed, nobody spoke for a moment. Then my uncle said quietly, That man had the time to perfectly press his shirt before coming to tell us his wife is missing. Nobody laughed, but the energy in the room shifted permanently. A few minutes later, Sam appeared at my door, looking at me in silence. "The arson investigator called before Wyatt showed up," he said. "They're already asking questions. They want to speak to anyone who has been in contact with you recently." I stood up slowly. "Good," I said. "That means they're already looking at him." The hardest part wasn't the hiding. The hardest part was the constant, agonizing pull of your own instincts. Every single second of every single day, your body screams at you to grab your phone, to call a familiar voice, to reach out to anyone who knows you, a coworker at the hospital, a friend from church, even the neighbor across the street, just to scream, "I'm alive." You have to sit with that torture and not move a muscle. My phone stayed completely off, locked in the deepest drawer of my mother's house. I only took it out once just to copy down a few essential numbers. Then Sam locked it right back up, and I never asked for it again. It wasn't that I couldn't use it, it was that I must not. In the chess match of law and investigation, that distinction is everything. My attorney made sure of one thing. Within hours of my arrival at my mother's house, the lead investigators on the fire knew I was alive. But because my name was already entered into the national database as a missing person, correcting that publicly too soon would have tipped our hand. It would have completely derailed the investigation and given him a chance to run. So every correction was handled quietly, behind closed doors, under absolute control. I was alive. I was safe. I had legal representation. But until the timing was perfect, I had to stay dead to the world. I couldn't call work. I couldn't check on friends. I couldn't explain to a single soul why I had vanished into thin air. Instead, I just watched. Using Sam's laptop, I watched my own name turn into a headline. First, it was a breaking news flash. Suburban Atlanta house fire, occupant unaccounted for. Then it became personal, my name, my age, my address. Next came the tributes. A co-worker posted a photo on Facebook from a hospital team-building trip 3 years ago. An elderly woman from church wrote a beautiful post on Instagram about my character that made my chest ache to read. I read every single word. Then I shut the laptop, walked into the next room, and sat with Cash in silence, never mentioning a word of what was happening online. Later that night, the local news showed the footage. It was a wide shot from the corner of the street, the exact same view I had from my car that morning. The flashing red lights, the blackened skeletal frame of our home. The news anchor spoke with that rehearsed, solemn caution reserved for unfolding tragedies. The cause of the fire is deemed suspicious. The investigation is ongoing. One resident is believed to have been inside. I muted the TV before they could say my name. Cash couldn't go to school. He couldn't talk to his friends. At 10 years old, everything familiar to him was stripped away. He handled it with a quiet, heartbreaking calm that was far worse than any breakdown. To keep us from losing our minds, I built a strict routine. 1 hour of reading, 1 hour of drawing, and early morning walks before the rest of the world woke up. During one of those walks, he looked up at me and whispered, "Are we safe now?" I told him we were. He just nodded and didn't ask again. I knew he didn't fully believe me, and honestly, neither did I. But we both chose to keep moving forward through the uncertainty instead of letting it consume us. Every day we made that choice together, and that was our strength. By the third day, the phone calls started coming to my mother's house. They weren't for me, but for her. Neighbors and relatives called to ask if she'd heard anything, desperate for updates. It was that rapid spread of neighborhood concern when something awful has happened but hasn't been fully confirmed. She handled it beautifully, keeping her answers incredibly brief. We're still waiting for news. No extra details, not a single syllable that could give me away. In the dead of night, I started replaying the past. I didn't picture the burned-out house. I hadn't seen enough of it to visualize it anyway. Instead, I replayed the conversations I had buried and the red flags I had ignored. Tiny moments that seemed meaningless back then now snapped together with a chilling new logic. I allowed myself to see them clearly, and then I forced myself to stop. Replaying the past was a waste of the precious time I needed to plan our next move. I couldn't afford to get lost in the past, not yet. By the end of the first week, the private investigator hired by my attorney tracked down the life insurance policy. The investigator didn't waste any time. He laid the documents right out on the kitchen table. I stared at the effective date, 14 months before the fire. I started doing the math. 14 months ago, I was in the absolute thick of the adoption process. The endless paperwork, the follow-up calls, the final home studies. I was fighting every single day to bring cash home. And Wyatt, the man sitting across from me at dinner, the man praying next to me in church, the man sleeping beside me, was quietly, calculatedly putting a price on my head. He knew I couldn't get pregnant. He only agreed to the adoption because saying no would have exposed his hypocrisy. And then he set a plan in motion to get rid of me. The child I fought for, the family I built from nothing, simply didn't fit into the new life he was already building elsewhere. He took the most painful, private struggle of my life and twisted it into a lie to gain sympathy from another woman. I laid the paperwork back on the table. I didn't cry. Something inside me shifted, hardening into a razor-sharp resolve that wouldn't back down. That night, my attorney sent a question through Sam. Does she want justice, or does she want him completely destroyed? It didn't even take me 10 seconds to answer. Both, I said. In that order. The first thing Sandra Gilchrist showed us wasn't the other woman. It was a timeline. She laid out the documents across my mother's dining table in a straight, cold line. Dates, locations, phone records, court filings. No emotion, just pure structure, cause, and effect. It was a chain of events so clear it didn't even need an explanation. I always thought a moment like this would feel incredibly dramatic, like a movie. It didn't. It just felt like sitting across from a very calm professional woman, watching her reduce my 8-year marriage to a criminal pattern I should have seen coming. Sandra had been doing family and civil investigations for 11 years, and it showed. She asked the questions I never would have thought of, recording the answers without a trace of emotion. It was both unsettling and deeply comforting. She was exactly who we needed. Over that first week, she uncovered layer after layer of the truth. Wyatt had returned to Atlanta from his business trip 2 days after the fire. He gave a brief, controlled statement to a local news outlet, sounding exactly like a grieving husband. After that, he went quiet. He was in complete control. He didn't rush the police for a death certificate, knowing that without a body the legal process would take time, but he had already consulted an attorney about expediting the process to have me declared legally dead in absentia. Sandra had the records of that consultation. He wasn't grieving, he was managing a timeline. She let that fact settle over the room before moving on. On the 5th day, she located the other woman. She lived in a city 3 hours away. She was visibly pregnant, about 6 months along, which put the conception right around 9 months before the fire. The timing lined up perfectly with when Wyatt took out the life insurance policy on me. Sandra slid the photos across the table without a word. They were taken in a public place, in broad daylight, with no attempt to hide. I stared at them for a long time. She was younger than me. She looked happy, with the glowing confidence of a woman who believed her life was heading in the perfect direction. I waited for the anger to hit me, but it didn't. What I felt instead was a terrifying sense of clarity. This woman had no idea. Whatever fairy tale she believed about the man she was having a baby with, she didn't know he was willing to destroy lives just to make room for her. That distinction mattered to me. I filed that detail away and kept going. The third discovery was a single page of phone records. Wyatt's phone showed frequent contact with a number registered to a man with a criminal record. The calls were heavily concentrated in the 2 weeks leading up to the fire, short, frequent, and incredibly deliberate. On the day of the fire, they stopped completely. It wasn't enough to convict him on its own, but it wasn't a coincidence. It was a blueprint. Sandra tapped her finger on the page, marking the turning point, and closed the folder halfway. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice completely level. "The contact. The middleman who connected your husband to the people who set the fire. We know who he is." She said the name, and before she could even finish, I recognized it. Finnick Darville, the nephew of a deacon at our church. The polite young man who always had kind words for me on Sundays, the one who had shaken my hand countless times after services. He was also the man who had driven slowly down our street on Tuesday morning while I was loading my luggage into the SUV. He had offered a casual wave from his steering wheel. I had looked up, assumed he was just a friendly neighbor, and went back to what I was doing. He wasn't just passing by. He was confirming that Wyatt was leaving, that we were still on schedule, and that the plan could move to the next phase. I had looked right at him and suspected nothing because I had no reason to. He had sat in the pew near me for years, close enough to observe everything, positioned perfectly to help tear my life apart. I sat and processed that for a long time in silence. Sandra didn't rush me. Only when I looked back up did she reopen the folder. "And there's this," she said, her tone unchanged. "Regarding the 2 men who actually set the fire." She paused. "One of them hasn't slept a full night since it happened. He's been quietly asking around, trying to find a way to make things right without ending up behind bars." She looked at me intently. "He doesn't know you're alive, but his conscience has left a door cracked open, and we are going to walk right through it." By the 6th week of seeing my name on the missing persons list, I stopped flinching. By the 8th week, I was sleeping through the night. By the 10th week, I realized something about myself that 8 years of marriage had buried so deeply I'd forgotten it existed. When the stakes are high enough, I am incredibly good at the long game. Wyatt had benefited from that trait for years without ever realizing it. Now he was going to experience it in a completely different way. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened in quiet moments. The morning I stopped crying in the shower and started making mental checklists. The afternoon I spent 3 hours with my lawyer, organizing the evidence and realizing my questions at the end of the meeting were much sharper than they were at the start. The evening I told Laura, who still sat with me every night ready to listen, that I didn't need to talk about my marriage anymore. I was done mourning it. She looked at me for a long moment and didn't say a word. For 3 months, that silence was the greatest respect my family could have given me. Of course, the break wasn't completely clean. In the middle of the 2nd month, late one night, I picked up the burner phone and dialed his number. I don't even remember making the decision. My body just did it. The phone rang once, then twice. Before the 3rd ring, I hung up. I sat there holding the phone for a long time. I wasn't shaking or crying. I was just cold with the realization of how close I had come to ruining everything we were building. I never picked up the phone to call him again. My lawyer advised that Cash's statement should be handled through a formal forensic interview at a child advocacy center. It would be conducted by a trained professional and recorded as official evidence, sparing him from having to testify live in a courtroom. It was the standard legal procedure to protect minors from aggressive cross-examination, preserving every single word of what he heard in that hallway. I didn't coach him. One evening, we sat on the back porch, and I explained what the process would look like. He asked if the people in the room would be mean. I told him they would be incredibly kind. He asked if it would be over quickly. I told him he could take as much time as he needed, and nobody would rush him for a single second. He nodded, opened his notebook, and spent the rest of the night drawing. I watched him, thinking about the terrible weight he had been carrying for so long. But I kept quiet. Some things are better honored with silence than words. Sandra's weekly updates painted a clear picture of Wyatt's new life, and it was obvious he didn't suspect a thing. He had transferred offices within his company and moved to that new city 3 hours away. Within his first 2 weeks, he joined a new church. He quickly rebuilt his reputation. He knew exactly how to buy trust in religious communities. He introduced the other woman as his fiancée. He was rebuilding the exact same social structure with a new woman in a new town, completely confident that the hardest part was behind him. He hadn't applied for a death certificate yet, as the legal waiting period wasn't over, but his lawyer was preparing the paperwork to expedite the declaration of death. He was managing his time perfectly, hiding behind the mask of a grieving widower doing everything expected of him. Then Sandra told me about the church ceremony. The rings, the vows, the crowded pews, the pastor officiating. But there was one catch. No legal marriage license had been filed. He knew that without a death certificate, signing a legal marriage license would be bigamy and fraud. He had cleverly avoided the legal trap by simply putting on a show for his new community, letting everyone believe they were witnessing a holy union. Sandra slid a photo across the table. It wasn't posed, it was taken from the side of the room. Wyatt stood next to her, his hand resting gently on her lower back. It was a gesture I knew all too well. I looked at it a second longer than I needed to, then turned it face down on the table. That calculation, knowing exactly how to have everything without leaving any legal trace, proved who Wyatt Pickens really was far better than any other piece of evidence. The witness who agreed to cooperate, Rufus Holloway, took 4 days to respond to our indirect contact. Through an intermediary, he asked 2 questions. Is she alive? And is there a way out of this that doesn't ruin the rest of my life? My attorney immediately started drafting a cooperation framework. Sandra called me that night. He's ready to talk, she said. When do you want to make the move? I didn't hesitate. When we have every single card in our hand, I said. Not a day sooner. I never met Rufus Holloway. and I didn't want to. Everything I knew about him came through Sandra, my attorney, and his official sworn statement. I read it alone at the kitchen table, but I found myself thinking about him more than I expected. A man who hadn't slept a full night in 3 months because he was terrified of a job he hadn't fully understood. There was no sympathy in my thoughts, just cold utility. I knew exactly who he was and what he was worth to our case. He and Caswell Treadwell had been contacted by Finnick Darville, who found them through a loose network on the fringes of the church community. They weren't professional hitmen, they were just desperate enough to see a payday and foolish enough to think they could get away with it. Years ago, Rufus had been involved in a small insurance fraud scheme, a minor case that never went to court, but it kept his name in certain circles. Finnick found him, and Wyatt's money did the rest. The offer made to Rufus was larger than anything he had ever handled. It was big enough to silence his doubts and make a highly complicated job sound incredibly simple. At first, he thought it was a clean break, an empty house, a fire, and a cut of an insurance payout. It sounded distant and victimless, until the instructions changed. Sandra pointed this out specifically while walking me through the statement. There had been pushback, not out of morality, but practicality. Rufus had checked twice through Finnick to make sure the house was supposed to be empty. The first time, he was told yes. Then, the instructions began to shift. The second time, the order came back clear and terrifying. Make sure they are inside. Only move forward if you confirm they are in the house. The payout is contingent on a confirmed tragedy. Sandra read those words without any drama. She didn't need to. The moment the plan shifted from property damage to murder was the exact moment Rufus should have walked away. But he didn't. They were already too deep. Money had changed hands, and promises had been made. Backing out felt more dangerous than going through with it. That's how people like Rufus get pulled in, not all at once, but through small, self-justified steps until they are trapped. It was this documented, repeated instruction, verified across multiple statements, that upgraded the charges from arson to conspiracy to commit murder. 2 counts, one for me and one for cash. They arrived after midnight. The house was dark, our SUV was in the driveway, and a single light was left on in the back of the house. They sat in their car longer than planned, watching and waiting. Rufus's statement described the scene in pieces. Caswell wanted to move fast, arguing that the longer they sat there, the higher the risk of being seen. Rufus insisted they needed to verify we were inside, as per the boss's orders. Caswell told him the car in the driveway was proof enough. People don't leave their car and disappear in the middle of the night. He said the light meant someone was home, and they had already wasted too much time. Hidden in the middle of that statement was a tiny detail. Rufus described cracking his door open, not getting out, but just stepping onto the pavement to feel the air. He stood there for 3 seconds, debating whether to walk up the steps and look through the window. 3 seconds. Then he shut the door. Not because he was sure we were inside, but because if he checked and we weren't, he would have to stop. And stopping meant facing the mess he had already agreed to. So, they told themselves the lie they needed to believe. That we were home, asleep, and the instructions had been met. They set the fire at 2 points on the ground floor, moving quickly, and then they drove away. They spent the next 3 months waiting for the news of a tragedy that never came, slowly realizing what that terrible silence actually meant. I read through the statement at a steady pace. I kept my composure until I reached the part confirming Cash's name was specifically mentioned in the instructions. Not as an afterthought, but as a target. The boy has to be in the house. I put the paper down and didn't touch it again for 20 minutes. When I finally picked it up, I was entirely cold. My attorney watched me, recognizing that look. It wasn't peace. It was the absolute numbness that comes when your emotions have been pushed far past their limit. Caswell Treadwell refused to cooperate. He was colder than Rufus, driven by calculation rather than conscience, and his math told him to keep his mouth shut. My attorney didn't mind. Rufus's complete statement, along with the phone records and the insurance timeline, was more than enough. Caswell's silence would only make his sentencing that much worse. Finnick Darville agreed to partial cooperation, offering enough to confirm his role and bridge the connection to Wyatt. He tried to paint himself as a simple middleman, but the specificity of the instructions he passed along made that defense useless. My attorney noted it all down. Every piece of the puzzle was in place. My attorney told me we were ready to make our move. I only asked one question. When is his next major public appearance at the church? My attorney looked at me for a long moment and I met her gaze without flinching. "I want this to happen," I said, "when the maximum number of people are watching." Sandra sent the photo on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee. I clicked on it, and for a second I didn't understand what I was looking at. Wyatt stood at the front of the church in a sharp, dark suit, his hand resting gently on the shoulder of a woman holding a newborn baby. Next to them stood the pastor, smiling warmly. The caption underneath read, "Celebrating new life and God's grace." I stared at the photo. The baby had been born 3 weeks ago, a little girl. The woman, Vanessa Beauford, as Sandra had identified her, was looking down at her child with that gentle, exhausted tenderness of a new mother who hadn't slept in days, but didn't care. She looked like a woman who believed she was exactly where she belonged. And Wyatt looked like a man who had never lost a thing. There wasn't a trace of hesitation in his posture, nor any sign of the life he had tried to burn down 3 months ago. He had rebuilt everything so quickly, tithing generously at this new church, joining committees, memorizing names, renting a beautiful home, and putting on a holy ceremony that everyone believed was a real marriage. An hour later, Sandra sent an audio recording from a small gathering at the same church. It wasn't a sermon, it was a personal testimony. Wyatt's voice was calm and controlled. He told the congregation that his first marriage had been dead for years, that his ex-wife never wanted children, and that she had abandoned him long before he had the strength to leave. He spoke with just the right amount of sorrow to win over the room. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else in that recording. He said, "Some people are simply not built for family, no matter how hard you try to give them one." I turned off the audio. I had heard enough. That story, built on the most painful struggle of my life and twisted into a lie about my character, was the deepest cut. It wasn't the betrayal or the fire, it was the ease with which he rewrote history, the absolute confidence in his own lies. I carefully set the phone down. Sandra confirmed that the church was planning a formal dedication ceremony for the baby, where the entire congregation, both families and community leaders, would be in attendance. It was scheduled for a Sunday, 3 weeks away. It was the moment every piece of his new, carefully constructed world would be gathered in one room, his reputation at its absolute peak. 3 weeks. I instructed my lawyer to have someone contact Vanessa Beauford privately before any public action was taken. She needed to hear the truth in the safety of her own home, not surrounded by a crowd watching her reaction. She hadn't created this mess, and she didn't deserve to be publicly humiliated. Sam thought I was being too soft. Laura said nothing, and that silence told me she understood. I told them both, "I know what it feels like to be the woman kept in the dark. I won't do that to her." The baby was innocent, born into a story she didn't choose. I thought about that child for a long time. That evening, I called Cash into my room. He walked in holding his notebook, and I waited for him to sit down before I spoke. Using words a 10-year-old could understand, I quietly told him that it was almost over. I told him that he had spoken the truth when it would have been much easier to stay silent, and now that truth was going to do exactly what it was meant to do. He listened quietly without interrupting, then he asked a single question. "Can we get a new house when this is over?" I smiled, a real smile, my first in 3 months. It surprised both of us. "Yes," I said, "we can get a new house." I didn't go to the church. I had made that decision weeks ago, and I never doubted it. Not because I was afraid to face him, but because over the last 3 months, I had rebuilt myself into a woman who didn't need to watch his downfall to know she had survived. I already knew what I had made it through. I didn't need to see his face to validate my victory. While the arrest was happening, I sat at my mother's dining room table. Cash was in the next room doing his reading hour. Olivia was in the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, that quiet, comforting sound of a woman who shows her love through actions. I sat at the exact same table where I had first met Sandra, where I had looked at the photos of Vanessa and her baby, and where I had read Rufus's confession. A cup of untouched coffee sat in front of me. The arrest warrant hadn't been rushed. It had been meticulously built, every statement recorded, every call verified, and every link between Wyatt, Finnick, and the 2 men who set the fire made absolutely unbreakable. Weeks ago, my attorney had walked the local detectives through the entire case. The police took their time to review every piece of evidence independently, confirming every detail. When the judge finally signed the warrant, it wasn't a matter of if, but when. The execution of justice was in the hands of the law, not mine. My attorney's contact inside the police department promised to text the second the net closed in. I kept watching the clock on the wall. 10:14, then 10:31, then 10:47. I slowly sipped my cold coffee. In the next room, I heard the soft rustle of Cash turning a page in his book. My mind drifted back to that morning 5 months ago at the airport terminal. I remembered the touch of Wyatt's hand on my forehead and that perfectly timed sterile hug. On my drive back, I had been casually planning dinner, and the entire time, he was silently counting down the hours, waiting for the night that was supposed to erase us from existence. 3 hours away in that other city, the baby dedication ceremony had just wrapped up. The church was still filled with that warm, post-service buzz, kids running around, people chatting over coffee and donuts, completely wrapped up in the joyful celebration. Wyatt stood there in his sharp suit, surrounded by the perfect new life he had built, every piece of his puzzle fitting seamlessly. But law enforcement had confirmed his location early that morning. They were just waiting for the right moment. Several plainclothes detectives and uniformed officers entered the church during the fellowship hour. They didn't make a dramatic scene. They simply walked up to him, showed their badges, and quietly asked him to step outside. He didn't fight it. In front of the very congregation that had welcomed him, witnessed his vows, and celebrated his new baby that morning, he kept his composure until the very last second. Calm, collected, and dignified. That was the last image he left them with as a free man. Once they were outside and away from the crowd, the officers read him his rights. At the exact same time on the other side of town, my lawyer's contact knocked on Vanessa Beauford's door. It was a deliberate choice. She was home with the baby when she opened the door to the news that would completely shatter her entire reality. I wasn't there to see it, but my lawyer confirmed it was done. I made sure she wouldn't have to face that devastating truth in a room full of staring eyes. It was the only dignity I could offer her, and I gave it. The burner phone on my table finally lit up. It was a 3-word text from my attorney. "It is done." I stared at the screen, then flipped the phone face down. I placed both hands flat on the table and let out a long, deep breath. It felt like a massive weight, one I had been carrying on my chest for 3 long months, had finally been lifted. It wasn't a burst of joy. It was something much quieter. The sheer, profound relief of letting go of a burden so heavy you had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. Cash appeared in the doorway, having heard me exhale. Without a word, he walked over and sat right next to me at the table. We sat there in silence for a long time. Outside, it was just a perfectly ordinary Sunday morning. We were still here. I watched his world fall apart like a controlled demolition. You know exactly what's coming. You understand the mechanics of it. But when the dust settles and the structure completely collapses, the sheer finality of it still takes your breath away. The public court filings laid out the charges: arson, insurance fraud, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 1 for me and 1 for Cash. The news hit both of Wyatt's social circles like an earthquake, and the damage was instant and permanent. In our old community, the church went through phases of shock. First came the disbelief, the kind reserved for a good man who led prayer groups, organized charity events, shook everyone's hand, and remembered every name. But then came the realization. People started putting the pieces together. Sandra sent me a short video someone had secretly recorded during a Wednesday night Bible study. The pastor stood at the pulpit, reading the indictment. His voice was steady, but the congregation wasn't. People were shifting uncomfortably in their pews. A woman in the second row slowly shook her head. A man stood up halfway through, then sat right back down, looking completely lost. Nobody interrupted, but the illusion was shattered. The tiny details people had buried in their minds suddenly began to realign with reality. They remembered how Wyatt had spoken of me in the past tense just weeks after the fire. They remembered how unnaturally calm he had been for a man whose family had vanished. They realized how incredibly fast he had packed up and left town, and how he had rarely shown any real warmth toward his adopted son during our 8 years there. The puzzle pieces had been there the entire time. People just hadn't put them together because they had no reason to. Finnick Darville's arrest was the hardest blow for our old church. He wasn't a stranger. He was an active, trusted member of the community who attended the same services, ate at the same potlucks, and volunteered at the same events. His arrest forced everyone to face a very uncomfortable truth. The rot hadn't crept in from the outside. It had been sitting right next to them in the pews. At his new church, the photos of the baby dedication were scrubbed from their social media pages within hours of the arrest. Sandra showed me the before and after screenshots. One minute it was a celebration of new life, the next it was just blank space. The pastor who had performed the ceremony was deeply embarrassed and furious behind closed doors. He had been used as a prop in Wyatt's moral performance, and his congregation had been the unwitting audience. Every ounce of social credibility Wyatt had built up over 3 months vanished in an instant. His family didn't rally to protect him either. They fell apart. His father, a church deacon whose entire worldview was built on the idea that a man who performs goodness is good, couldn't comprehend his son's actions. The shame and grief were too heavy for him to put into words. His mother went completely silent, that heavy, frozen silence that happens when a tragedy is too structural for tears. His siblings split. One immediately cut ties to protect their own standing in the community, refusing to carry the burden of a crime they had nothing to do with. The other tried to defend him at first, not because they believed he was innocent, but because they couldn't bear to tear down everything they thought they knew about their family. This public fracturing of a prominent family, played out in a small southern community where everyone knows everyone, was a reckoning Wyatt had never accounted for. Rufus Holloway's cooperation earned him a lighter charge. He still faced prison time, but his sentence would be a fraction of what Caswell Treadwell was looking at. Caswell's stubborn silence cost him everything during sentencing. Finnick Darville's attempt to bargain for partial cooperation was rejected by the prosecution because his role in passing along the specific instructions was too clear and undeniable. His lawyer spent months trying to reduce his sentence with very little luck. Vanessa Beauford cooperated fully with the investigation. She truly knew nothing, and the law treated her justly. She took her daughter and moved back to her hometown, where her family kept her safe and protected. I didn't do any media interviews, make any public statements, or appear on any television specials. My lawyer spoke only when absolutely necessary, keeping it incredibly brief. The story was told entirely through the evidence compiled by the prosecution, which is exactly how I wanted it. I didn't need to play the victim. The documents spoke for themselves. I watched his world crumble, not out of a desire for revenge, but to make sure every single pillar of his lies was completely destroyed. I wanted to ensure there was nothing left for him to quietly rebuild later. My lawyer called on a Thursday afternoon. Wyatt had requested through his defense attorney to speak with me before the trial began. I listened to the request in silence, then simply said, "No, tell him no." And I hung up. 3 people told me I didn't need to testify: my lawyer, Sam, and Olivia. My mother only said it once and never brought it up again because she knew me too well. Saying it twice would have turned into an argument. They all used different words to say the same thing. The evidence was bulletproof, and the prosecution's case was rock solid. There was no reason to put myself through the stress of a courtroom. But I testified anyway, not for the case but for myself. On the witness stand, I didn't break down. I was precise. The prosecutor guided me through the timeline. The drive to the airport, Cash's warning in the car, staying at my mother's, driving back the next morning, stopping at the corner out of habit, and looking down the street at the ruins of my home. I answered every question directly, never offering a single word more than what was asked. I never looked at Wyatt while I spoke. I kept my eyes locked on the prosecutor or focused on a neutral point just above the jury. For the first time in 5 months, he was only 15 feet away from me. But I gave him absolutely nothing. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to find a weakness. He pointed out that I hadn't looked at his client once, suggesting it showed a lack of confidence in my own story, and asked if I was absolutely certain of my testimony. I turned my head and looked directly at him, not at Wyatt but at his lawyer, and said a single word. Yes. The word hung in the quiet courtroom without any defense or apology. He had no choice but to move on to his next question. The only time my composure wavered was when the prosecutor asked me to describe the exact moment I realized Cash had been a target. I paused. It was the only pause in my entire testimony. It wasn't out of weakness. It was just that some truths require you to take a deep breath before you can find the strength to say them out loud. Then, I answered the question and kept going. Later, some of the jurors mentioned that this single pause was the moment the sheer cruelty of the crime truly hit them. I didn't know that at the time. I was just speaking the truth at the only pace it allowed. Cash didn't have to testify in court. His forensic interview, recorded months earlier at the Child Advocacy Center, was entered into evidence and played on the courtroom screens. I had already seen it, so I didn't watch the monitor. Instead, I watched the jury. I watched their expressions slowly change as they took it in. On the tape, Cash spoke in the quiet, steady voice of a 10-year-old who had learned far too early that truth is the only thing that keeps you safe. He didn't exaggerate or play up his fear. He simply recounted the words he had heard in that hallway, the tone of voice, and the instinctual danger his body had sensed before his mind could fully grasp it. The courtroom was dead silent while the video played. When it ended, nobody moved for a long time. The defense focused almost entirely on trying to break the chain of evidence connecting Wyatt to the two men who set the fire. It was their only play, and they handled it professionally. But the mountain of evidence was simply too high. Rufus Holloway's confession, the phone records, the timeline of the insurance policy, Finnick Darville's testimony, and that final chilling directive. Make sure they are inside. The boy has to be in the house. The jury saw the whole picture. There was no room for reasonable doubt. They found him guilty on all major charges. When the verdict was read, Wyatt took it the same way he handled everything else in public. He kept his composure, maintaining his dignified mask until the very end. I watched the bailiffs handcuff him and lead him out of the courtroom, and I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't the rush of revenge. It was something much quieter. It felt like a door that had been left wide open for years, letting in a cold, relentless draft had finally been shut. The draft was gone, and I could finally feel the warmth. My family was waiting for me on the courthouse steps. Cash wasn't there. I had been very firm about that. He was home with my uncle watching cartoons. Olivia silently slipped her arm through mine as we walked to the car. She waited until we were both buckled in before she spoke. "So what do you want to do now?" she asked. I looked out the window at the ordinary Atlanta traffic, realizing that until this exact moment, I hadn't allowed myself to think about a future. All my energy had been focused on just getting to this day, and now that it was here, the road ahead was wide open. "I want to go home," I said. She squeezed my hand. "Okay, let's go build you one." 4 months after the sentencing, Cash started at his new school. New school, new town, new teachers. Here, nobody knew what he had carried for the past year. His teachers treated him like any other kid walking into their classroom. That anonymity was exactly what he needed, and it was the sole reason I chose this district. Sometimes the most healing place in the world is a room where nobody knows your story. I drove him on his first day. I watched him walk through the front doors with his backpack and notebook tucked under his arm, never looking back. I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I could bring myself to put the car in drive. I counted. 11 minutes with my hands on my lap, just letting my body fully believe that he was safe inside before I could drive away. He never talked about the fire directly. He didn't bring up the trial, the hallway, or any of it in a straight line. His way of processing was quiet and indirect. At dinner, he would occasionally ask a seemingly random question that was actually connected to everything. I learned to answer him directly, without making him feel like he was being closely analyzed. That skill took me longer to master than I care to admit, but I consider it one of the most important things I've ever learned. One evening while we were washing dishes, he asked a question out of nowhere, without even looking up from the plate he was drying. "Were you ever mad at me for not telling you sooner?" I turned off the faucet and looked at him. I didn't soften my tone or give him a long, dramatic speech. I just gave him the absolute truth. "What you did that day was the bravest thing I've ever seen. All I feel is grateful." He nodded and went back to drying the plate. After a moment, he said, "I was just scared that if I said something too early, he would do something to us right then." "I know," I said. "You were right to wait." He nodded again, and that was it. But I could see something shift inside him, settling deep into place. The tension he had carried since that hallway finally let go. I didn't say anything else. Some things are better left unsaid. Our civil settlement with the insurance company and the other parties was finalized by the end of the year. The payout wasn't an astronomical fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to buy our new home outright, close to my family, and to fully repay Sam for all the legal and investigative expenses he had covered during those 3 months. He told me I didn't have to pay him back, but I told him I needed to. He understood. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. Cash's adoption was never legally challenged. He was my son, completely and legally mine. Nothing in the criminal trial could touch that. When I told him, he just said, "I know." There was a confidence in his voice I hadn't heard before. not the hopeful tone of a child wishing for security, but the calm certainty of a kid who knew it was an absolute fact. I noticed the change but kept quiet, letting that truth exist between us. We moved into our new house on a Friday. By Saturday morning, it already felt like ours. I sat with my coffee while he sketched in his notebook, the TV playing in the background as background noise. Neither of us spoke. We were just two people sharing a quiet room in a life they had fought for and won back. I looked across the room at him, remembering the little boy who had stood in that dark hallway, clutching the closet door handle. He had held on to the most dangerous secret of our lives, waiting in the dark for the perfect moment to save us. He looked up from his notebook. "Mom, I want to learn how to cook." I held my coffee cup and looked at him. "What do you want to learn first?" He thought about it very seriously. "Something hard," he said. I smiled. "Okay, let's make something hard." Sometimes people ask me how I survived. It's usually women who have heard pieces of the story through neighborhood gossip, knowing something terrible happened but not understanding what it cost. They ask with genuine care, and I always pause before answering. Because the real answer is far more complicated than what they want to hear. They want me to talk about faith, family, and inner strength. And all of those things are true. But the most honest answer is this. I survived because a boy who had already lost far too much in his 10 years of life made a decision. He decided he wasn't going to lose anything else. And everything we did to fight back started the moment he stood in that hallway. I went back to hospital administration in our new city. After the arrest, all of my credentials and professional records were fully restored through the legal system. Different hospital, same job. My new colleagues knew nothing about my past unless I chose to share it. The work gave me a sense of order, and for the first time I truly appreciated that routine, instead of using it to numb myself. There is a big difference between needing a routine and actually appreciating it, and I had finally crossed over to the other side. My family dynamic changed too. It wasn't that we suddenly loved each other more, but the crisis had burned away all the polite distance families keep to stay comfortable. What was left was incredibly strong. Laura and I talk almost every night now. Sam and I have an ongoing friendly debate over who makes the best jollof rice, and neither of us is backing down. My mother, Olivia, has a key to my house and walks in whenever she pleases. And I don't pretend to mind anymore, because it's exactly what I want. Vanessa Beaufort and I never crossed paths again, and we probably never will. I heard through back channels that she is doing well back in her hometown, surrounded by family, raising her daughter. I don't wish her any ill will, but I don't actively wish her well either. I simply took her off the list of things I carry. She wasn't the villain in this story. The villain is in prison. Those are two different facts, and I keep them separate. I don't trust easily anymore. Looking back, I suppose I never did, but now I understand why, and that realization feels more like wisdom than trauma. I haven't closed myself off. I've just become incredibly observant. I know the difference between the two now, and I plan to keep it that way. I used to try to blame myself for that marriage. During our 6th week in hiding, I actually tried to carry that guilt, but then I threw it away because it was neither accurate nor useful. I had been trying to read a master manipulator who had spent his entire adult life practicing how to be misread. I wasn't foolish, I was targeted. Those are two completely different things, and I refuse to confuse them just to make the pain easier to digest. 3 months after we moved in, Cash celebrated his 11th birthday. He has friends at his new school now. Every Sunday evening we cook together, tackling incredibly difficult recipes, laughing when they turn out a mess and eating them anyway. He still carries his notebook everywhere. One evening I asked if I could see what he'd been drawing lately. He hesitated for a second. A hesitation that was actually a huge step forward. He weighed the question instead of instinctively hiding the book away like he used to. Then, he handed it over. I flipped through the pages. Houses. Page after page of different houses. Different shapes, different sizes, all with unique details on the windows and doors. I looked up at him. He gave a small shrug. I was just thinking about what a home looks like. I closed the notebook and handed it back. I looked at this child. The boy who had whispered the truth I almost ignored. The 10-year-old who had stood in that hallway keeping us alive with his quiet courage. I thought about what a home looks like. I looked around the room we were sitting in. I already knew the answer.